Well, thanks for joining me today. We're talking about the Savannah Accelerated Development Authority. And SADA, we know a couple of months ago had been embroiled in a lot more controversy than many would have wished it hadn't been in, just because of some misappropriations we're told about contracts, as well as some issues of fund allocations. Well, they now have a new chief executive who was appointed in June this year, 2014 we're talking about. And Charles Abugre comes with a lot of experience and not only managing a lot more issues of poverty, underdevelopment with ISODEC, Third World Network and other institutions here in Ghana, but also just before leaving this very job had occupied the position of a deputy director at the UN Millennium Campaign Office that's based in Kenya, here in Africa. And Charles Abugre is my guest for the morning. Thanks for joining me, Charles.
Thank you.
All right. You have heard about the difficulties that SADA has been through.
Yes.
Did you know you take up the position of the job?
No.
Okay. So, in your estimation, as you've assumed office, it's been how many months? 3 months?
I was sworn in late June.
Late June.
I spent the first 2 weeks with the new board, because an entirely new board was also constituted. And this was to kind of start to deal with the issues that had been raised in the audit report, which was the subject of a lot of media discussion. So I spent about 3 weeks and then went back to Kenya because I still have to hand over my job in the UN. And came back again at the end of July. And I will be here continuously for 3 months as part of an extended leave prior to separation with UNDP.
What do you think, in your estimation, after having assumed office, is the difficulty with SADA?
Well, first, let's be clear that it's still a very, very young institution. The law created it in late September 2010. It was effectively put in place in 2012. It's to date still has an exceedingly small professional team of 10 people. If you add the chief executive officer, that's 11. This is 4 directors and 2 professional staff, and the rest are support staff. This was the beginning of the building of an institution. The building process of the institution is really yet to happen fully. So first, there's an institutional capacity questions. But when the institutional building process began, I think the leadership team felt excessively under, under pressure of expectations. You have to understand that the SADA zone stares you with poverty, and people do expect that when an institution set up to address their poverty and needs, they want it now, not in the next 10 years.
From what you're saying, do you think SADA has gone through all these difficulties because they didn't have the right caliber of personnel? Because from what you're saying, it's still a young institution, or has been a young institution. Didn't have, as far as we're concerned, the adequate resources humanly for it to function adequately. Is that why perhaps it's underperformed since inception?
I don't know whether it is the right sort of personnel as opposed to the pressures of the beginning stages of an institution that generated such expectation.
And so resulted in the lapses?
Lapses resulted in an approach to delivering its mandate, which required a direct, visible delivery mechanism. What do I mean by this? The team felt, I think, compelled to show that they are doing things to increase agricultural productivity immediately and to green the north. By the approach that was used, therefore, was to try and procure agricultural inputs, set up what they call technical service providers, which are intermediate groups that deal with the farmers. I think the model overall was not disastrous. But when you have an institution without the capability to address and all of the accountability and monitoring systems doing delivery of equipment and tractors and inputs, it certainly generates the potential for lapses because institutionally the organization wasn't ready. But the weight of expectation probably pushed the team into this model. Secondly, the weight of expectation pushed it to deliver its tree planting program, which is absolutely critical for the Savannah area, and increasing productivity of guinea fowls, which is also absolutely critical because embedded in household income generation strategies. But it pushed it to, rather than take a slower way of mobilizing, to try and kickstart this in a big way, which is what led to the provision of a bigger contract. And the capacity constraints therefore also they suggest that, so rather than create a dispersed mechanism of delivery, you send them out on contracts, and therefore you have a fewer set of institutions to monitor. I think these overall meant that the institution was doing two things simultaneously: trying to build its own institutional capacity for accountability on the one hand, which was still in the nascent stages, and having to deliver to expectations on the other. Obviously, every institution has failures at the beginning. Let's be very clear about this. Every institution, whether it's a private sector institution or public sector institution, if you look critically at it, it doesn't matter where the institution is located, faces lots of constraints. And therefore, those constraints can help you rethink when they are in the public domain, or they can weigh you down, in terms of basically creating the atmosphere.
And so, Mr. Bugri, so over the course of time, and especially with what the investigations have been undertaken following the being made public of the auditor report, which gave indications that contracts were awarded, and even not duly, and the execution also were very much problematic, physically not on the ground.
No, okay. First and foremost, the award mechanisms, especially the use of sole source, contracting processes, went through authorizations for single source contracting. So the authorizations were done. So it is difficult to say that they were illegal in that context.
I haven't mentioned illegal.
Okay. So what therefore it meant was that in that, the driver to the sole source contracting, which is the large contract award mechanism, was precisely because the institution was in no position to oversee a dispersed mechanism for delivery of the programs. This is so clearly the audited report, which was in the public domain, was a draft management letter, which was going back and forth in the discussions between the organization and the auditors. The auditors raised a lot of procedural issues, and those procedural questions are again a reflection of the state of institutional capacity of the organization, which was barely 2 years on the ground.
Now, going by what you have just told me, do you think, in your own estimation, with all the experiences you've had in over 2 decades of service, especially working on projects of poverty reduction for various charities, etc., that perhaps because we didn't have the right institutions and the right personnel, the takeoff should have been delayed?
No, I think see this Act 805 2010 gives SADA a very extensive set of authorities.
We do know that.
Okay. It can choose, it can cut the slice in different ways. It can cut the slice in the delivery, approach. It can also cut the slice from a facilitation approach, a coordination approach. Now, facilitation, coordination, and stimulation, but facilitating resources to come, facilitating the institutions that you need to put in place to deliver. All of these things take time. That is why I keep telling you that the weight of expectations on the institution was perhaps overwhelming.
That's why I also asked you, do you think that perhaps then we should have a bit delayed the full takeoff in terms of when SADA would have been ready to start awarding contracts for projects to be implemented under its own guidelines, etc. Yeah. By then, they would have built the right institutions and capacity.
Maybe, you see, again, when you have difficulties in an organization, it is really often an advantage. If you work in the private sector, they would tell you your initial failures is your biggest change driver. So this experience, very young in the life of the organization, tells it that in fact, maybe the biggest potential impact that SADA can make is not direct delivery in any form. It doesn't matter whether it is now or it is 5-10 years time, but rather creating the opportunities for others to deliver, catalyzing the flow of investment. What I'm saying to you is that it is not that they needed to wait until it's ready to deliver. That the lessons we are learning is that, in fact, it is the delivery models itself, the delivery mechanism and approach itself needs to be rethought.
In trying to commence a certain idea and a project and a grand initiative like SADA and all the failures that have been experienced, do you think that perhaps we should have said it was a platform and a vehicle or a period by which would have been a learning or has been a learning process, and so that is excusable despite all the failures that have been experienced?
See, this has been an interesting learning process. I mean,
which has cost the nation dearly.
No, but it also has many positive things.
Which one? People have gone to the project sites, and the projects which were duly awarded are physically not on the ground.
People have gone to...
Trees are supposed to be built.
Yes.
They are not, are supposed to have been planted. They are not there. You're supposed to have vast acreages of farms, of guinea fowl farms, which virtually have contained no guinea fowls at all.
I am not denying failures in the delivery mechanism. I am saying that the important lesson, which is really crucial in the building of an institution meant to last over a long term, is that its biggest strength actually lies in not trying to deliver directly. This lesson would have taken a very long time to be learned, and therefore the potential impact of a shift would have been much, much, much smaller in my view.
Which would also have resulted in the nation incurring a lot of debt then, going by what you're saying.
No, which in a sense would say that the lessons learned from what... I mean, I say to you there are positives, and we'll discuss that positives. But I'm saying to you that those early stage discovery that an institution meant to bring about structural change in a society cannot do it effectively by directly delivering would lead, if we shift appropriately would lead to a leap in a manner that was probably that the benefits will far outweigh the cost of lessons that you are talking about. So I'm saying, when you think of structural reforms and the role of an institution in the long term, the cost, the financial cost, is heaviest when it takes you a long time to make shift. You know, slow drip death. You kind of stay in there, nothing.
So you're saying that it's better we discovered it earlier?
Is not.
But that's not an excuse, is it, Mr.
No, it's not an excuse. I am simply making it's not an excuse that an institution is set up and it delivers in a manner
the way
that generates a public outcry, and then it has to struggle to justify how it is done. I am simply saying to you that the institution was exceedingly young. They did what they did and the weight of expectations. The good thing about our society is that we, as a public media, which generates a debate and forces the institution to rethink early in its life and therefore relaunch. This process, actually, from the short experience I have had sitting here as acting CEO for SADA, is that it's very, very welcome by people who build institutions. They understand that, in fact, this was perhaps the best thing that could have happened to this institution going forward. This is not an excuse.
And the misapplication, as well as even perhaps the contracts that were given to institutions that were not able to execute them adequately.
Some of those can be addressed, are being addressed by the board, the details one at a time. So failures of delivery is part of the development process. So that the development process always are ups and downs, and your downs early help you in going up. But on the specific issues of waste and whether resources that were applied in certain areas require, addressing in terms of recouping it and development effectiveness, the board deals with that. I keep telling you that in institutional building, especially institutions such as SADA, designed to do what Act 805 tells it to do, that these experiences are exceedingly valuable.
Do you think that perhaps the president and whoever advised him to appoint the people he appointed to head SADA got it wrong?
You see, these things are always hindsight.
I don't get you.
When you appoint somebody, such as myself, you take my credentials as they are. There are no guarantees that in 5 years' time, I will not have failings.
So you're telling us that by 5 years' time, there could be a guarantee that you could be a failure?
No, every manager works to succeed. In 5 years' time, you can be a failure as an anchor for a news.
That's a probability.
There's always a probability. And we know this from hindsight. This is the reason why you can't, it's difficult, even when you recruit and interview and recruit, you go by what the paper tells you. You go by your interaction with the person. You go with their track record of experience. So it's difficult for me to say that the president failed in his. The president has a practical experience on hindsight. This is, and therefore acts on that. So has he failed? Not at all. Because if you fail to act on the basis of the actual hindsight experience of people's practices, then you failed.
You keep telling us that the board is looking at all those inefficiencies that were experienced, and those were detailed in the draft report that were circulated publicly, have been looked at by the board. What is the board looking at?
Oh, the board are looking at the procedural things. There's a lot of procedural problems.
Specifications what?
Well, I'll come to them. So the board will look at procedural things, how you go about contracting, whether or not sole sourcing contracts were the best way to go for it, and whether one could have done that slightly differently. The reporting and accountability mechanisms, but also the effectiveness, in terms of the delivery of contracts which were signed with various clients, and whether therefore there's culpability in terms of the performance, and therefore whether the state has the right to claw back some of the money that is being put in, and the processes for clawing back some of those monies. So they are going through each one of these, from guinea fowls to tree planting, but also other forms of input support programs that the organization has been implementing. And in some cases, I'm being a member of the board, I know that there are processes led by the Attorney General's Department to try and sort out the issues of reinvestment of money. But in many of the cases, it's that the institution's own capability to monitor was the problem. If the institution's own capability to monitor what it had contracted is the problem, then it comes back to the institution's capacity building and the institution's structuring overall to deliver its
Well,
mandate.
we'll come to the subject of what in terms of the content of the human resource you have now. And so if you want to talk about the capacity of the institution
Sure.
to, in going forward, deal with all the exigencies that likely are going to be faced, there are. Since you took over and your interaction with personnel and getting yourself acquainted with whatever happened, and your discussions at the board, it's not as if you have to disclose anything that is said at the board level. How much so far has been lost in this whole melee of difficulties that you've experienced? I like to call them difficulties because you're saying it's a learning process.
Yes, we've lost time in building the institution. As I said at the beginning, there are 10 full-time staff that work for the institution. I mean, the SADA zone is more than half the geographic area of Ghana. I mean, we're talking about a massive spatial challenge and a spatial operational zone. And 10 people, is impossible for 10 people to sit in Accra, or one or two in Accra and the rest in Tamale, and run this. So it's lost time, in terms of building its role, especially its coordination role. So the productivity losses associated with these tensions are massive. But what I would say to you is this, and of course, the goodwill that existed at the beginning and the potential to carry so many people forward took a bit of a knock. But what I would say to you is that when I was very surprised, I am an active social media person, so I have a Facebook page. So when I was recruited, I asked people, what do they think SADA should do or not do? Ever since, and we've gone through, it was an overwhelming response. The goodwill remains. I have offers, people are currently actively working in very informal groups virtually, helping us to think through some of the way to go and some of the capacity gaps and the issues. That's overwhelming. That would go forward. It has generated a new form of nationalism, to deal with, and I mean nationalism because the people who are actively helping us to think through one thing or the other are not necessarily from the SADA zone. This is good. It probably would have taken a long time to generate this type of nationalism and the mobilization of ideas. Secondly, the small team is professional. I mean, this, I have no doubt about that.
You mean they're more professional than they were?
No. Remember, many of them were recruited in 2013. As I told you, the institution is exceedingly young. It is in its embryonic stages. Many of them are a year or less in the organization. So they are, and if you recall from that audit report, many of the activities were conducted through short-term consultancies. This is because of the entire recruitment pace of public services and so on. So there was the full-time staff were only recruited in 2013 last year. What I'm saying is, as I say, new team, it just was getting to grips there when the problems hit. It's a very professional new team. And so I didn't walk into the place in an empty space. I walked into a place with a small professional group, passionate to do some work, hit back hard by the media revelations and the public outcry, feeling vulnerable and not even able to say in the public, I work for SADA, because this was happening. So my advantage is this, that it's a small, committed, professional team.
You mean
and
now
together,
committed?
No,
Now
they've
committed.
always been.
Always been committed.
Always been.
With all the exigencies that have been recorded, always been committed.
As I told you, they were recruited only in 2013. So the full-time team is a year
You're just making an
less.
excuse for them, Mr. Bukri.
No,
okay,
no.
Which other projects are you looking at as an institution?
Okay, no.
Going forward?
No, going forward is a very interesting set of processes. First and foremost, going forward, we have to rethink the strategic role of the organization, and we are in that process. In that thinking process, here are the kinds of things that we are going forward with, and we are consulting broadly about. First, this institution's biggest potential impact is to be able to work with anybody, institutions on the ground, to mobilize. We've got to try and...
Which ground? You mean institutions in the SADA area?
Institutions in the SADA area on the ground. And national institutions that want to... just to mobilize. Give people the inspiration to do many of the things they could do for themselves. So give people the inspiration to plant their own trees. Create the incentives, you know, for people to protect the bushes. Work with the churches. Let's get, you know, the tree planting process part of an ethos, you know, part of the living reality of the people. And we are talking about millions of people. If even 1/3 of them were to plant 5 or 10 trees, we are talking about millions of trees. This is one part. Mobilization, the belief in the people are absolutely critical. That we have to build. And we have the authority and the mandate to do this through coordination. That's the first one. The second one is coordination. And this has begun in an interesting way. You know, the SADA zone, because of the depth of poverty, is the place where with the greatest concentration of NGOs and development partners. Each one of them are trying to do some good. The development partners on themselves coordinate, they get together. The government systems are divided in several different ways. Part of the mandate of SADA is to create the platforms in which those who are trying to do things on the ground speak to each other, learn from each other, create additionalities, determine the gaps. This is started in agriculture. It's about to start in social protection programs. It will happen like this across several sectors.
Can you give me specifications in terms of what the projects are, if it's in a Greek, if it's in...
Okay, you keep talking about projects, but there are the existing projects which we have to try and fold up and transition them. Remember, SADA supplied over 270 tractors, which have plowed over 35,000 hectares across the place. This has contributed in the last few years to quite a significant increase in productivity in maize and rice. In fact, maize production in the SADA zone is quite huge. This is one of the things that has contributed to price stability, and we fear that in fact if we continue like this without addressing, you know, the question of markets, we will have another problem. But it's not just SADA. You know, several development partners are into the agric area. SADA also, the mango plantation has led to nearly 2,000 hectares of plantation, and the most successful is in Northern Volta in terms of mango plantation. But we just don't have to do plantations. SADA has been delivering these fertilizer inputs and so on. This has contributed significantly to things, but we have to transition them. SADA does not have the capability to run an agricultural input support program. So what are we thinking of in agricultural input support program? There are a lot of private sector entities Ghanaians, not just Ghanaians from the SADA zone, but Ghanaians, who are partnering with foreign companies. Some of it funded through government, public sector, bilateral, private sector support programs, who are currently working with us to look at the mechanisms for the supply of agricultural inputs. Whether they are through plant pooling systems, if they are plant pooling systems, the tractors go there, or they are heavy or they are a rehabilitation of the storage systems across the SADA area that facilitates a much more effective private sector-led distribution with our support in order to keep prices down. This is going on. We will transition the tractors, we will transition the input supplies, but we will continue to support input supplies. Currently, the guinea fowl program, as I said to you at the beginning, guinea fowl cultivation and multiplication in the SADA zone is a must. But we have to change the approach. What is the approach that we are changing? We are pulling together the farmers. The Catholic Church is, for example, quite successful in mobilizing farmers, for guinea fowl cultivation. There are lessons that exist of successful support to farmers. We will plug into those lessons. We will use that coordination process. So let me say this. We have to transition this program, not drop the idea, but transition them using a different model of approach. But there are new ways, things coming on stream. Should I continue? The new things are these. One, we must understand that the biggest problem, a contributory factor to entrenched poverty, is underinvestment of all sorts.
Meaning?
Very little money comes into the SADA zone relative to the rest of the country. Very little money.
A lot of money went in there, but the projects were not undertaken in many respects.
But if you put it all together, it's really tiny relative to need. So whether it is a private sector
but that doesn't make it excusable for those.
No, but you still kept an excuse. You asked me to think forward, and I'm telling you that there is the truth that in per capita expenditure, whether it's a private sector investment expenditure or it's a public sector expenditure, is still tiny in relative to need and opportunity in the area. We have to catalyze, the resource flows into that area a lot more, whether it's into the infrastructure area or it is to make private investment work in agriculture, in real estate, in processing sector, even in the in infrastructure that has a commercial potential, in input distribution, in the assembly and supply of equipment, in irrigation development, using a combination of public and private sector models. There is a need to catalyze resources into that area. The discussions we are having is, and we are consulting with both development partners, but also within government systems and SADA zone people, is how might we think strategically about creating and catalyzing investment vehicles. A vehicle that enables the resources to flow into the SADA area, which is not necessarily controlled by SADA as an institution, but is going through a professional institution that is capable of providing the guarantees, for private sector investment, which cuts out eventually the need for government guarantees. A professional institution similar to, in our view, the Development Bank for South Africa, where resources come in through a professional institution that goes into catalyzing investments in a major way, but which is partly, held by government of Ghana, which is SADA, but most of the equity held by institutional investors and development banking institutions. This is absolutely critical. If the approach to transforming that place is to catalyze resources and turn those things into profitable investment to create jobs. There are no jobs. There are no major industrial potential. There is no active, vibrant, real estate sector. There is a large potential, productivity increase in irrigated agriculture. All of these cannot be done by SADA or as a government institution, but by catalyzing these things to happen. We are in the process of investigating these. There is, since I came, or it started long before I came, there's a steady flow of investors looking to do one thing or the other, to build industrial estates. The Chinese firms are together with Ghanaians. Ghanaians, I mean Ghanaians, not SADA people per se. Ghanaians wanting to relocate industrial enterprise in the SADA zone. Why? Because we have the whole of the Sahel as a potential market. It's the gateway to Burkina, it's the gateway to Niger, it's a gateway to Mali, it's a gateway to part of Togo, northern Nigeria, and also Ivory Coast. Therefore, SADA can become a potential gateway for manufacturing in that sector. What should SADA be doing? We set ourselves up to catalyze and solve these problems, including land. That means we should build a capability to deal with the land issues that cushions the possibility for people who want to invest in the SADA area to do so.
Mr. Bugri, the UN resident coordinator in Ghana, Ruby Sanju Rojo,
Former.
Okay, had indicated before she left that while poverty was reducing down south, and it was indicated in the Human Development Report that extremely we had about 2.5 million down south who had been taken out of poverty. We still have it being endemic in the north. If you go to the north, many of the farmers still farm subsistence. It doesn't mean that even in the rest of the country it is better. But you have mentioned the industries are not there. If there are small cottage industries or makeover industries that perhaps may be operating in households, maybe doing some share butter activities, etc., how do they now get access to funding, and despite not having the right structures?
But this is one of the problems about catalyzing the right sorts of institutions. Financing is a big problem. This is the thing about the investment vehicle. So I'll give you a number of examples. There is a really interesting processing company based in Bolgatanga. What do they process? They process the baobab juice. The baobab tree has a white flesh inside it, the fruit. When you dry that fruit and you add water, you turn it into powder, you add water to it. You don't even need to add sugar. It's delicious. It's the major drink bottled in Senegal and the Gambia. The potential is huge. What is holding them? Cold vans. All they need is cold vans because they add no additives to their bottled products. Cold vans to move them to Tamale, cold vans to move them to Kumasi, cold vans to deliver them to Accra. It will expand their capacity utilization just like that. They were even saying to us that the Palago tomato factory, a number of the small companies there are quite happy to pull together and utilize the infrastructure and scale up the processing of agricultural products. There is no lack of initiative, but there is no structural funding. They do not know how to finance these cold vans. The banks will not give them a loan, and they cannot afford a loan at 35 to 37% interest rate.
So how will you go about it?
This is what I said about the need to create a financing vehicle to support investment. First, there are a number of discussions we've started. We need to pool the rural banks together. So similar to the way that we created the Apex, the Rural Bank Apex mechanism in Accra, and in the early days I was involved in its creation. We have to apex them in the Savannah zone. When you apex them, you pull it together, you pool their risks. And when you inject resources into them so that they can be the mechanism for financing this rural processing, that's the first one. The second is that we have to have a financial instrument, an investment instrument that is dealing with the rural banks, that is dealing with the microfinance institution, that is directly providing long-term lending, such as equipment and machinery, to the to the company. This is why I'm saying to you, there is an issue of institutional building to catalyze these things that Ms. Rojo said, and she's completely right. The latest Ghana Living Standard Survey says the same. Poverty has dropped everywhere, including the Savannah zone, but it's dropped least. And the gap between the Savannah zone and the rest of the country remains steep, even widening. And the main difference is investment.
Okay. It's good that the investments go to the Savannah regions of the country. How do we make sure that we don't tend to do a replication of what is happening in the general atmosphere of the country, in which investments, perhaps whether they're foreign directed, etc., coming, and when there are inflows as far as funding is concerned, either by way of profit, etc., they are not repatriated back in. So we have perhaps big firms in the south who invest in the north. The money doesn't stay in the north.
We have to think through the reinvestment incentives. What are the incentives to encourage the reinvestment of profits?
Meaning what? Whatever they get there,
whatever
they reinvest back into the same
for
businesses.
Expansion or new businesses or diversification. We have to create that incentive system.
That's mere talk. How are you going to make sure that is adequately done? That's in the textbooks, all that you're saying. That's good.
It's creating spaces for people to discuss this. SADA can't have solutions for private sector. SADA can create the spaces for private sector entities to talk to each other. So to begin with, in March next year, on the back of the conference of the Ghana Institution of Engineers, we will be working with them to try and do a number of things, Magnus Kwashi and his group, to try and do a number of things, to do concepts for infrastructure investment and business concepts, papers, including up to pre-feasibility level, 3D models. Use the conference as an opportunity to actually have a fair, an investment fair, something of a bazaar, an exhibition of the potential, the possibilities, and the opportunities. On the back of that, we hold an investment conference. This will be the beginning of the creation of spaces for continuous discussion. We've also started to plug into already ongoing initiatives of groups that are trying to create chambers of commerce and businesses. So you have the Upper East Business Entrepreneurs Association, the Upper West Entrepreneurs Association, the Northern Entrepreneurs Association. We have to catalyze this in all of the SADA zones, Northern Brunghafo and Northern Volta region. When we have institutions of the private sector, we talk with them, we listen, we use the mandate of SADA to help solve these problems. They would find the solutions for increasing the incentives for reinvestment of profits. I'm sure.
Okay. Do you have timelines to achieve some of these? Or these are all ongoing processes?
As I said, some things are tied down already. The first investment conference we are planning for March 2015. This is solid on the ground. That means between now and March 2015, we would have had these associations of entrepreneurs pooled together. They would have an input into it. So we create a first major platform for going forward in the investment area in March 2015. That's our first roadmap starting point. The second roadmap starting point is that we are aiming at also a real estate fair to catalyze the real estate sector. Tamale Airport is expanding international airport. The opportunities for storage, for cold houses, for all of these exist. We'll be trying to work with the Lands Department to acquire some land and block it to catalyze investment across the place. The housing fair we are aiming at for about June next year. So these are things we are building. Remember, we are starting to do two things simultaneously. Address the problems of the past and build the institutional capacity to move into these new areas. Therefore, we have to go with tentatively, step by step, as we expand the conversations with our stakeholders.
As you think in this very direction, and for any initiative, or if it's a product or a service or a portfolio, whatever, there will be some inherent weaknesses and some threats, etc. Currently, inherent in the environment, in the Savannah region, what really do you think are some of the challenges that you need to overcome beyond all that you've said? Either there could be socio-cultural, there could be things that are endemic in the systems, in the operational activities of those who tend to work there.
Several. One, there's a perception of the place being violent, hot, and not hospitable to live in.
Perception among which sections, which population of the world?
Perception, you know, when you talk the north, you talk conflicts, partly because of chieftaincy problems in one place or the other. We have to address these perceptions of conflict. But we also have to work strongly with those who deal with peace and conflicting to understand that we have to deal with it. If we don't deal with it, small little things create this perception. Secondly, we have to deal with the complexities of the land tenure system, because it is a constraint in many ways. But the land tenure system, not simply so people can acquire them, but also so that the people can participate in business initiatives using their land. We have to think about this. Thirdly, there's massive ill health, which also comes out of poverty. We have to deal with the health system and the health gaps. Therefore, we are interested in the national insurance system working. We are interested in the escalation of the, the social protection, grants, so that it covers a lot more people. And we are interested in catalyzing new players into the health sector, which is a bridge between philanthropic, public, and private sector health systems in that place. Anytime anybody is sick, seriously, they all have to come to Kumasi or come to Accra. This is quite a distance, to deal with. You have to deal with rural transport. Rural transport is a major constraint because of the nature of the infrastructure. Therefore, we are interested in companies that support and working with them so that they can assemble motor kings and transform their models so that they can carry human beings, not just goods piled up in them, that they can create cold vans and so on and so forth. We have to solve this problem. There's an energy access problem. It's the lowest energy consumption. Energy consumption, when it is this low, constrains your ability to transform your society and even for your children to do well in school. We have to solve the problem. Although SADA is working with others to create these massive solar farms that are beginning to set up, they will just feed into the national grid. They won't necessarily solve energy access problems. So we need to think about off-grid, decentralized energy systems that reach our schools, that reach our clinics and hospitals, and that reach our villages. These things are long-term, but they are the things that create the context for opportunity, and for progress. Those we try to work with. Cultural, actually the cultural things of the Savannah zone is a big plus. It is a potential business. The dancing is, everybody wants to see it, but it's not commercialized. Our festivals are not organized and commercialized, but they are unique. We have horses in that place. There is no horse riding culture in the rest of the country but there.
So you're saying whilst these are there, these could be turned into opportunities?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, in making sure that you get the right people, should it always be the perception that unless you come from the Savannah region, that is when you can empathize enough to sacrifice for whatever initiatives and whatever projects that perhaps could be perceived under SADA?
Oh no, this is, as I've said many times, SADA is a national program to deal with a national problem. It's a cross-party consensus because more than half the geographic area is under-transformed. When it is transformed, the rest of the country, it transforms massively with it. So no, This is the people feeding into the ideas about the program are not from the Savannah zone and only, and the recruitment going forward. Already, you know, it's not everybody who works in SADA are from the Savannah zone, but the recruitment going forward, we'll be very conscious of this. When we have the permission to recruit, we will make sure that the recruitment process are driven by recruitment agencies. It should be totally off anybody's mark and to make sure that it's professional. This is to draw expertise from Ghanaians wherever they are, and whether they live in Ghana or they live outside Ghana and want to be able to serve.
You've worked with ISODEC, you've worked with a Third World Network, and even work in the UN systems. Now, you should know that SADA, just like any other initiative that is expected to improve the livelihoods of people, is political. And prior to the last election, the MPP said they wanted or had in mind the Northern Development Authority. The NDC said SADA, so we have SADA in place because, of course, the NDC won. But the point is, do you as chief executive dream that this is political, and so at some point the dream could be shattered, just like we've witnessed in other national initiatives that are curtailed when there's always a change in power in terms of the structures, the way the dream is, the way it's supposed to be done, etc.?
There's always that danger. It depends on the way we work.
As a country?
As a country and as an institution, SADA. Right. First, we are making the case that we really do need to rebrand SADA to emphasize its national nature and its cross-party nature. I have started these discussions with senior people in the MPP and other parties.
You have?
Oh, yes. So I think, you know, SADA would never, even that SADA law would never have passed without the MPP, the PNC, and other smaller parties behind it. In fact, the people who tabled it were not NDC. So, yes, there was the back and forth debate as to what the geographic boundary is, but its roots are in the Northern Development Fund created by former President Kufuor. SADA is a vehicle. The question of geographic space is neither here nor there. That portions of Bronga Ahafo share the same ecological opportunities and problems that the rest of the Savannah zone, it's the reality. How we work at it so that we harness this overall opportunity is the challenge of the institution. So I have no doubt that if we work in a manner that is open to all ideas, that both President Mahama and the leadership of the other parties will be behind SADA. That is a challenge we must take forward, but I'm very convinced that the leadership of the other parties, the MPP in particular as the second biggest party, is behind the SADA idea. When the institution functions in a manner as to demonstrate partisanship, it is right that people feel uncomfortable. When the institution runs in a manner as to be open to all ideas of all people, I am very sure that Ghanaians are very objective and people, and they will continue to support an institution they brought about.
Well, thank you very much. And I've had as my guest Charles Akiyeri Abugri. He is the acting chief executive officer of SADA. You're acting?
Yes.
When will you be confirmed?
I wait for Public Service Commission to do so.
All right. So we hope to have you again sometime in the studio to again elaborate on us, the going forward of the institution SADA. And that's been our discussion on the Savannah Accelerated Development Authority. And despite all the difficulties the institution has gone through, what it's doing by way of going forward. And thanks, Mr. Bugri. Okay, we're taking a break. When we come back,